On this day 15 years ago, Operation Red Dawn was launched in the Iraqi town of ad-Dawr. That led to the capture of the dictator Saddam Hussein. Now, Hussein was found hiding in a so-called spider hole at 8:30 p.m. local time, and he did not resist capture. But shortly after, images of his heavily bearded and dishevelled Saddam were broadcast around the planet. Now, the trial of Saddam Hussein was conducted by the Iraqi interim government for crimes against humanity during his time in office. And on November 5th, 2006, Saddam was sentenced to death by hanging. Now, today I'm joined in the studio by France 24's Wassim Nasr, who specialises in Middle Eastern politics and specifically jihadist movements. You're very welcome on the programme today. Thanks for coming over. First, how do you think the images of Saddam before and after his execution affected the people who were formerly loyal to the Ba'athist regime?
Of course, it was very humiliating for his people, but it was even, I would like to say, humiliating for the Arab street as a whole. Because despite the fact that he was a dictator, culturally speaking, showing these pictures of him heavily bearded, checking his mouth like an animal, very degrading pictures, created a kind of turmoil, despite the fact that people were like supporters or not. Of Saddam Hussein. So people said that he could have been arrested without this kind of humiliation, which has a real emotional impact in the Arab street.
Indeed, and the pictures, of course, of him sticking out his tongue that were putting in, it was like he was in a child in a doctor's office. But following his execution, it has been suggested in some quarters that it was after Saddam's execution that the former loyalists just went underground and planned their return, and then they evolved into the Islamic State armed group that then took the world by storm in 2014. Is that being too simplistic?
Yes, of course, it's too simplistic. But if we want to talk again about the images, the most shocking were his execution.
Sure.
The images that were put out in a determined way, showing him being insulted by his executioners, which were Shia, which created the real friction between Sunnis and Shia, which was already existing in the country. But to go back to your question. No, it's too simplistic to say this, because a kind of Islamization of the army started even before the Saddam being downed. He himself initiated some programs because he needed a religious cry for his fight. Okay, so he went into this knowing that before he was against Islamists. He was oppressing with the Salafists in his country, being or proning a secular government, which finally profited the Sunni minority. But that's another subject. So it was prior to his end in 2003, and then it was amplified by the American intervention. But you see that middle class officers, okay. Of course, they had their Ba'athist card, party card, because otherwise they wouldn't be officers. Okay, so everybody has this card, but it doesn't mean that they were that conviction was secular and Ba'athist. Okay, they had to have it to be in the army. That's it. And then many of them went on the path of Islamization, political Islam at least, and then became jihadis in American prisons in Iraq, in Abu Ghraib, in Buqa, where they met. If you look at the heads of the Islamic State today, or those who are still living and those who died, you see that they met and they made their plans in American prisons.
And speaking of the Islamification, if you will, of the Iraqi army, even before Saddam's fall, how is Saddam Hussein viewed today in 2014 by people who are fighting jihad at the moment, by jihadists, and also by young people who would have never known Saddam Hussein or grew up after his death even?
It's a very good question, because many think that jihadis support Saddam Hussein. It's not true at all. They consider him as a dictator, as a taghut, as they say, not abiding by Sharia law, who oppressed the Salafis and the jihadis in Iraq. So he is declared to be a non-believer. and they are against the Ba'ath today. And we saw it when Islamic State took over Mosul, for example, or other parts of Iraq. They were very harsh on former Ba'athists, and even on Naqshbandi, who are supporters of Saddam Hussein. And in Islamic State propaganda, Islamic State literature, Islamic State videos, statements, private conversation that I had with some of them in Iraq, they consider themselves as enemies of Saddam Hussein, you see. But doesn't mean that in their ranks there is no former officers, middle ranked officers of the army of Saddam Hussein, but still those are convinced jihadis,
yes.
and not at all former Ba'athists playing it as jihadis.
Now, going back to 2003, would you agree that it was the US invasion of Iraq and the fall of Saddam that actually led to the current state of international jihad, or with the evolution of the internet that it would have happened anyway?
I don't know. It would have happened anyway in this kind of picture that we have today. But anyways, it started at least before the American intervention. But what happened with the American intervention, that it amplified it, okay, and it amplified it in a way that was that sticked at least to the jihadi storytelling.
Yeah.
Because what was Bin Laden saying? Bin Laden was saying that, regarding the prophecy of Islam, armies will be constituted in Yemen, in Sham, in Syria, and armies will be constituted in Iraq. And if you go even back before, and in Khorasan, which means Afghanistan, and we go back before Bin Laden, jihadi scholars that wrote many things, if you go into them, you see they consider that jihad started by the loss of the West Bank in 67, because following the prophecy, the armies of Islam should fight east of the Jordan River.
Yes,
and they thought that this loss was a win for the jihadi ideology. And so, in the same way, this Israeli win in 67 that put maybe the first coin in this story, the American intervention in Iraq put another coin.
Sure. And something completely off topic, but off this specific topic. With your contacts and your experience, Wassim, where do you believe that the Strasbourg suspect will maybe turn up? That's Sherif Shekat. They believe that the investigation is that he's left the country. With your experience and with your contacts, what do you think his moves
with my
are?
experience, I can tell you that it is very unpredictable, and they are very imaginative, the jihadis. And remember, for example, the attacker of the Christmas market in Berlin was killed in Milano.
Yes.
In Italy. Because he thought that there he will find some place to hide. So, and on the other hand, Salah Abdeslam, one of the 13th of November attackers, the last surviving member of the crew, was hiding in his neighborhood in Brussels at Molenbeek.
Under everybody's nose.
Under everybody's nose. So we don't know.
Yeah.
He might pop up in Strasbourg, or maybe he's far away. So we don't know. And I would like to remind you that regarding Salah Abdeslam, many people were saying during days and weeks on media outlets that he went through Eastern Europe, profiting from real Islamic State cells, and now he's in Syria. And we ended up to see that he didn't have any web, any cells, nothing. He was hiding in the neighborhood. So
we will wait and see. Wassim Nasr, thank you very much for being on the program today.